Hi there, and welcome back to another profile of American history. Today I'm going to be discussing Phillis Wheatley. For a newspaper style primary source document, go ahead and check down in the description of the video, and you'll be able to get even more information through the link provided there. So, who was Phillis Wheatley? She was also known as the African American poet of the Revolution, and what she's probably most well known for is the fact that she was the first African American poet and author to publish a book and gain international recognition. Here's a quote. It's an excerpt from her biography published in the Freedom's Journal in 1827. The Freedom's Journal, for those of you who don't know, is the first African American owned and operated newspaper in the United States. So here's an excerpt from her biography from that newspaper. Phillis Wheatley, like thousands of poor African sons and daughters, was torn from the land of her nativity and brought to this country in 1761, when she was sold to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. She was then about 7 or 8 years old, and being much like her master, she was soon enabled to read and write English. Her aptitude for learning was soon discovered and cherished by the family, who freed her from the drudgery and cares of the household, and thus gave her opportunities for pursuing her studies. Burning with zeal to improve herself in all useful knowledge, she began the study of the Latin language, in which she soon became proficient. So there's a little preview for you of what her early life was like. So here's some biographical information. She was born around 1753 and died in 1784. She was seized from the Senegambia region in West Africa. And as the quote had earlier, she was purchased in Boston by the Wheatley family. And when they soon found how quickly she was learning the English language, they provided her with more opportunities alongside her domestic duties. So it shouldn't be confused that she was just allowed to study and was treated as an equal, but rather it was incorporated into her domestic duties. So her first published poem happened at age 13. And after that, we'll talk about her poetry accomplishments later. But in 1778, she did marry a free Black lawyer and grocer. Unfortunately, their life was marked by poverty and struggle. Likely had three children who did not survive. She was never able to find a publisher after her first book was published, and she died alone and in poverty at age 31. So a pretty sad ending to her life. But let's get into her contributions. So what we want to remember is at what time Phillis Wheatley is living. So she was born right around the time of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, but of course these years would have been spent in Africa. So when she comes to America, there are some Enlightenment ideas, Protestant evangelicalism that are happening, that are being discussed. They are a huge component of life in the colonies, as well as kind of this independence movement, these ideas of liberty and freedom. It's also important to note that by 1770, about 42,000 Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic for enslavement. And Boston, being the third largest colonial city, Blacks made up about 8% of the population. So then again, we want to note that the Revolutionary War was occurring during more of her adult years, before 31 when she passed away. So, international recognition. She became more famous and internationally known when she published The Elegy of George Whitefield. He was the leader of the First Great Awakening. And so, people in England, especially, were well aware of this Great Awakening, and this elegy brought her significant fame. So, she created this book. I believe it was about 28 poems, and she had to go before almost like what we would consider today like a PhD panel, where she has to defend her thesis. She has to defend these poems and prove that she, in fact, was the author, because most people at this time did not consider African Americans to be capable of this level of creativity and intelligent thought. So, after John Wheatley and other important people in the colonies did confirm that she was the author, she travels to London to publish her book and go on a literary tour in England. Another poem that brought her some international recognition was the poem to George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He then invited her to meet him, and while it's not absolutely sure that they visited, most likely they did. And this may have led to an evolution of Washington's attitudes regarding slavery. We can see in the subsequent months that he ends up allowing enslaved persons to fight for the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. And as I mentioned earlier, she ends up being recognized globally as a poet of the Revolution. Here's one of her most controversial poems. It's called On Being Brought from Africa to America. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." So this is a poem that garners quite a bit of criticism because it seems as though she's thankful for her enslavement, that it has brought her from being a pagan to a Christian. And so a lot of people see this and really criticize her role in African American literature, her role in the abolitionist movement that was growing. But sometimes those criticizers fail to address some of her other poems. So here's one. It's an excerpt from the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I young in life by seeming cruel fate was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never fear tyrannic sway." So here is much more open against is much more supportive of the idea of freedom and against what had happened to her, and hoping and praying that this wouldn't happen to other people. Okay, and then maybe her most obvious criticism of slavery is where she compares it to the principles of the American Revolution. This is in a letter to Reverend Samson Occam. "Reverend and honored sir, I have this day received your obliging kind epistle, and I am greatly satisfied with your reasons respecting the Negroes, and think highly reasonable what you offer in vindication of their natural rights. The glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty, which are so inseparably limited that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. Otherwise, perhaps the Israelites had been less solicitous in their freedom from Egyptian slavery. I do not say they would have been contented without it. By no means, for in every human breast God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine." So very clear here, comparing the enslavement of the Israelites in Christianity to the Egyptians, to the enslavement of Africans by those in the colonies that are advocating for their own freedom from Britain. So this one is a very clear criticism of slavery in America. So Harvard professor John Stoffert gave this lecture in a class he called The History of American Protest. And in this, he is addressing particularly the poem, the very first poem on being brought from Africa to America. And he argues that that poem is actually a very subtle protest. The message has been controversial because it's less a protest. She says it's merciful that I was yanked as a slave and brought to North America on the Middle Passage, and it was merciful because it enabled me to become a Christian. Then in the last line, remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. In one sense, you could say it's a very subtle but radical protest poem because she needs to speak as a fellow Christian to other Christians so that they'll listen to her. So they presuppose their superior status, so they will listen to her. She writes a poem that they will feel comfortable reading and accepting because she doesn't challenge explicitly their superior status. But by ending, join the angelic train, essentially she's saying that we are all equal. In God's eyes, we are equal. God is no respecter of persons. And for many Christians, that meant we should be equal on earth as well. She does that very subtly, very subtly. So interesting, an interesting take on that first poem, which many have criticized Wheatley for. But maybe if you consider the fact that she would not have been published had she explicitly had she been more vocally opposed to slavery. Others would not have read her poem. And so she has to include these ideas of protest very subtly. So what is her significance? Contribution to the arts. It is believed that around 145 poems were written by Wheatley. However, many of them have been lost throughout history. Kind of continuing the idea of Professor John Stoffer, she is exhibiting the beginnings of poetry of protest, which is a common thread in American history. As for the abolitionist movement, which was growing, it demonstrated that Black people were equally capable of creativity and intelligence. She did that through this incredible accomplishment of publishing this book. She did influence the growing abolitionist movement and inspired other African Americans, especially African American writers. Publishing notable achievements, but particularly of a book. She was the first American enslaved person, the first person of African descent, and the third colonial woman to publish a book. So I hope this video was interesting for you and helpful for you in understanding the life of Phillis Wheatley. If so, please like and subscribe.